the president has been surrounded by medical and security staff for days wearing full PPE. And yesterday, the U.S. Secret Service agents were in that same level of PPE for a very short period of time. We've worked with our infectious disease experts to make some recommendations for how to keep everything safe down at the White House for the president and those around him.
The medical team today, they didn't say a lot of things. They also didn't say whether the president will be confined once he's back at the White House or what that kind of quarantine would look like.
No, they didn't. And so they were specifically asked, will he have to stay in the residence or can the president go to the Oval Office, into the West Wing? Of course, they are on two opposite sides of campus, and the doctor did not answer that question. Instead, he just said they're going to work to the best of their ability to allow the president to be able to carry out his everyday duties.
What's up, people? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. So this is happening right now. Reports of a serious Trump medical episode behind closed White House doors have been met with total radio silence from the administration. No dismissal, no reassurance, nothing. And in the long history of presidential communications, total silence has never once signaled that everything was fine. This is the moment where the narrative takes a turn into genuinely unsettling territory. Social media platforms detonated with activity as ordinary citizens, political observers, and self-described eyewitnesses began sharing accounts of what they claimed to have witnessed. People came forward describing an alarming situation that unfolded during a compressed window, observers speaking about events that appeared to catch even the most senior staff members off guard.
Over the past 24 hours, the president has continued to improve. He's met or exceeded all standard hospital discharge criteria. He'll receive another dose of remdesivir here today, and then we plan to get him home. It's been more than 72 hours since his last fever. Oxygen levels, including ambulatory saturations and his work of breathing, are all normal. Though he may not entirely be out of the woods yet, the team and I agree that all our evaluations, and most importantly, his clinical status, support the president's safe return home, where he'll be surrounded by world-class medical care 24/7.
Now, I can already anticipate the skepticism forming in your mind. Social media is a chaotic landscape filled with exaggeration, misinformation, and the kind of runaway speculation that can transform a minor incident into an international crisis within the span of a single news cycle. That skepticism is healthy and warranted. But here is the detail that should make even the most cynical observer sit up and pay careful attention. When multiple independent sources begin converging on the same essential narrative, when the accounts start aligning in ways that suggest coordination without any evidence of actual coordination, and when the White House responds to direct questioning with nothing but stony refusal to engage.
Follow up on former President Biden. White House doctors may have missed the early stages of his prostate cancer. So is President Trump worried about the quality of care that presidents get here?
Not as far as President Trump is concerned. The White House physician we have here is phenomenal, and the team of physicians that take care of the president, particularly at Walter Reed Medical Center, are great. The president had his physical recently, as you know. He had perfect results. He's in very good shape. I think those of you who traveled to the Middle East with us last week can attest to the president's endurance. And by the way, I will add, we returned home from a very long and tiring trip last week, and on Saturday, where was the president? In the Oval Office working all day. He doesn't stop, he doesn't quit, he's in great health, and he trusts his physician.
That combination of factors changes the equation entirely. That is no longer just noise. That is a signal cutting through the static, and it demands to be taken seriously. The White House officials who found themselves cornered by journalists seeking basic clarification provided a masterclass in evasion that would be almost impressive if the stakes were not so extraordinarily high. When pressed with the most straightforward question imaginable, whether the president had undergone a cognitive assessment following his most recent MRI scan, the response was a refusal to provide any clarity whatsoever.
On another note, I know that many in the media have been speculating about bruising on the president's hand and also swelling in the president's legs. So in the effort of transparency, the president wanted me to share a note from his physician with all of you today. In recent weeks, President Trump noted mild swelling in his lower legs. In keeping with routine medical care and out of an abundance of caution, this concern was thoroughly evaluated by the White House medical unit. The president underwent a comprehensive examination, including diagnostic vascular studies. Bilateral lower extremity venous Doppler ultrasounds were performed and revealed chronic venous insufficiency, a benign and common condition, particularly in individuals over the age of 70. Importantly, there was no evidence of deep vein thrombosis or arterial disease.
This is not a complicated inquiry. The answer is binary. Either the cognitive test was administered or it was not. Either the president sat down with medical professionals for the standard evaluation that any person of his age might reasonably undergo after brain imaging, or the medical team determined such testing was unnecessary and documented that determination. The question does not require nuance. It does not require interpretation. It requires a yes or a no, and the administration cannot bring itself to utter either syllable. They retreat behind the comfortable shield of medical privacy, citing patient confidentiality as though the ordinary rules of doctor-patient relationships apply without modification to the individual who holds the nuclear launch codes and makes daily decisions affecting the lives of millions of citizens. That argument sounds plausible for approximately 5 seconds, right up until the moment you remember exactly which patient we are discussing. Let me state this with absolute clarity, because the distinction matters enormously. This is not a conversation about political ideology. This is not about whether your personal feelings toward Donald Trump are warm or hostile. This is not about partisan loyalty or tribal identity or any of the other divisions that typically frame our national debates. This is about something far more fundamental. This is about the basic principle of transparency as it applies to the most powerful office on the planet. Journalists across the spectrum, political opponents who have spent years criticizing the president, even some voices within his own coalition, are now demanding straightforward answers to questions that should never have needed to be asked in the first place. Their argument rests on a foundation so simple that it should be entirely uncontroversial. The American people possess an absolute right to know whether their president is physically and mentally capable of discharging the duties of the office. That is not a partisan attack. That is not a smear campaign dressed up in respectable language. That is common sense, articulated in its purest form. Medical professionals from across the country have begun weighing in on this situation with assessments that range from measured concern to outright alarm, and they are not pulling their punches. These are physicians and specialists who have dedicated their careers to understanding the subtle indicators of declining health, and what they are observing in the president's public presentation is generating serious discussion within their professional community. They are pointing to evidence that they describe as mounting, not isolated, not anecdotal, but accumulating over time in ways that form a concerning pattern. They are highlighting visible changes in speech patterns, alterations that any attentive viewer can detect if they know what to look for. They are noting slower movement, less fluid physical coordination, and the kind of high-profile verbal slips and cognitive stumbles that everyone has noticed, but that most political commentators have been reluctant to address directly. The aging process is universal and inescapable. Every human being who lives long enough will experience its effects, and there is no shame in acknowledging that reality. But when the individual experiencing those effects occupies the Oval Office, when there are legitimate and unanswered questions about capacity and capability that transforms a private medical matter into a matter of urgent public concern, the contrast between how this situation is being handled and how similar situations have been handled in the recent past is so stark that it borders on the absurd. Consider what our national discourse dedicated itself to for years. We spent literal years, sustained and uninterrupted years, engaged in a national conversation about Joe Biden's age and physical fitness. Every stumble on a staircase was freeze-framed and analyzed by panelists. Every verbal misstep was dissected for hidden meaning and diagnostic significance. The cable news ecosystem ran segments on this topic with the reliability of a metronome, returning to the question of Biden's capacity day after day, month after month, until it became part of the background radiation of American political life. Some of that coverage was entirely fair and justified. Some of it veered into territory that was clearly excessive and gratuitous. But regardless of where you fell on that spectrum, there was at minimum a robust discussion taking place. There was an acknowledgement, however imperfect, that presidential health constitutes a matter of legitimate public interest. But now that the questions are being directed at Donald Trump, the same voices that demanded every detail of Biden's medical history have fallen into a conspicuous and revealing silence. The dynamic is almost comical in its transparency. operating exactly as you would expect if standards were being adjusted in real time based on whose fitness was under the microscope. That double standard should disturb every person who cares about the integrity of our political system, regardless of which side of the aisle they call home. Here's the factual foundation we can establish with certainty amid all the swirling speculation. Something significant occurred at the White House that triggered the activation of immediate medical evaluation protocols. The specific nature of that something remains shrouded behind an administration determined to control the flow of information. They will not provide details about what happened. They will not release comprehensive medical records that would allow independent physicians to assess the president's condition. They will not confirm whether basic diagnostic tests were administered or what those tests revealed. And all of this is unfolding against the backdrop of a nation moving steadily toward a critical midterm election cycle, where the question of Trump's fitness for office is already emerging as a defining campaign issue. The secrecy is not incidental to this story. The secrecy is the story. Consider the logic that governs crisis communications in any other context. If the situation were genuinely routine, if the medical episode had been minor and resolved without lingering concern, if there were truly nothing for the public to worry about, the administration would be racing to provide that reassurance. They would issue a detailed statement from the White House physician. They would make the doctor available for a press conference. They would release relevant test results with appropriate context provided by medical professionals. They would recognize that uncertainty creates its own damage and move aggressively to eliminate it. But they are doing none of those things. They are allowing the questions to multiply and fester. They are creating the conditions in which conspiracy theories flourish naturally. They are surrendering the narrative to whatever dark speculation the public imagination can generate. Perhaps they have calculated that mystery serves their purposes better than clarity. Perhaps they believe that the news cycle will eventually rescue them, that the next scandal or controversy will arrive on schedule and sweep this uncomfortable moment into the memory hole. But that strategy contains a fundamental flaw when applied to questions of presidential health. Uncertainty in this arena is not merely inconvenient, it is actively dangerous. Markets react to signals of instability at the highest levels of government. Foreign adversaries monitor American political developments with the attention of predators assessing the vulnerability of their prey. Government officials within our own system begin discussing contingency plans, having quiet conversations about succession protocols and crisis management that would be unthinkable under conditions of normal transparency. The practical consequences of uncertainty ripple outward in ways that affect national security, economic confidence, and the basic functioning of the executive branch. This is not happening in isolation either. The broader context makes the opacity even more troubling. International tensions are simmering at dangerous temperatures. Economic indicators are flashing warning signs that demand decisive and capable leadership. Domestic policy battles are reaching critical junctures where presidential attention and cognitive clarity will determine outcomes that affect millions of lives. And positioned directly in the center of all these converging pressures is an administration asking the American people to simply trust that everything is fine while refusing to answer the most elementary questions about the president's condition. That is not how accountability functions in a mature democracy. There is another dimension to this story that has been troubling close observers of presidential health transparency for years. The pattern of behavior surrounding Trump's medical disclosures has been consistently evasive across multiple administrations. Cast your memory back to the surprise hospital visit during his first term, the one the communications staff attempted to characterize as entirely routine, despite the complete absence of advance notice or subsequent explanation. Recall the infamous doctor's letter from his initial campaign, the one that proclaimed he would be the healthiest individual ever to assume the presidency, a document that the physician himself later acknowledged had been essentially dictated by Trump personally. There exists an extensive and well-documented history of minimizing symptoms, deflecting direct questions, and presenting information to the public that later proved to be incomplete or misleading. This is not a single incident being blown out of proportion by hostile media. This is a sustained and consistent pattern of treating the public's right to know as an inconvenience to be managed rather than an obligation to be honored. So yes, what is happening right now matters profoundly. It matters more than the architectural controversies that have been dominating headlines. It matters more than the daily churn of social media provocations and political feuds, because at the foundation of everything else lies a single essential question. Is the person entrusted with the highest office in the land actually capable of exercising that authority? That question is not being answered, and the absence of an answer is doing damage that will compound with every passing day of silence. Let us examine more closely what the medical community is actually observing, because the pattern goes far deeper than any single incident or episode. Donald Trump's relationship with medical transparency has never followed the traditional path expected of presidential candidates and office holders. The pattern was established early, during his initial campaign for the Republican nomination, when he released a letter from his personal physician that employed language so effusive and so stylistically aligned with Trump's own rhetorical patterns that it immediately raised questions about authorship and independence. The physician later confirmed what many had suspected, that Trump had essentially composed the document himself and the doctor had signed it. This established a precedent that has never been corrected. Throughout his time in the White House across both terms he has served, there has been a consistent and observable tendency to downplay health concerns, to release information that is incomplete or carefully curated, and to respond to legitimate inquiries with hostility rather than openness. Every administration engages in some degree of image management. The presidency is a performative office in many respects, and no White House communications team wants their principal to appear weak or vulnerable. But there exists a critical distinction between putting your best foot forward and actively constructing barriers around information the public has a legitimate interest in receiving. The MRI situation is where this pattern becomes particularly difficult to defend. The reports indicate that Trump underwent brain imaging, which for a man of his age is precisely the kind of preventive care that responsible physicians recommend. There is nothing inherently alarming about a patient in their late 70s receiving an MRI. The procedure is routine, it is non-invasive, and it can detect issues before they become emergencies. The question that transforms this from standard medical practice into a matter of public controversy is what followed afterward. When journalists asked the straightforward question of whether a cognitive assessment was administered after the imaging was completed, the White House response was to provide no response at all. Not an affirmative confirmation that the test was conducted and the president performed well. Not an explanation that the medical team determined such testing was unnecessary based on the imaging results. Just a refusal to engage with the question on any terms. The significance of this refusal is difficult to overstate. Medical professionals will explain that cognitive screening following brain imaging is a common and unremarkable practice, particularly for patients in higher age brackets. The tests are not invasive or humiliating. They typically require perhaps 30 minutes to complete. They assess basic functions like memory, processing speed, and executive function, providing a baseline that can be compared against future assessments to track changes over time. If the president underwent such testing and performed within normal parameters, that would be a positive story for the administration. It would demonstrate that their principal is being monitored carefully and remains sharp. The fact that they refuse to provide this basic information strongly suggests one of two scenarios, neither of which reflects well on the administration's commitment to transparency. Either the testing was not conducted, which raises obvious questions about why standard medical follow-up was omitted for the President of the United States, or the testing was conducted and the results are not something the administration wishes to discuss publicly. The role of speculation in this conversation deserves careful examination because the administration's defenders consistently deploy accusations of speculation as though the word itself functions as a refutation. When you withhold basic information that any reasonable person would expect to receive, you do not eliminate speculation. You create a vacuum, and vacuums do not remain empty. They fill with whatever is available. The public will draw conclusions based on the evidence they can observe, and when official sources refuse to provide countervailing evidence, the observed evidence becomes the only basis for judgment. Medical professionals who have analyzed Trump's public appearances have documented specific changes that they find noteworthy. Speech patterns that differ measurably from his presentation in earlier years, with increased frequency of slurring and apparent difficulty locating intended words. Physical movement that appears slower and less assured, with gait changes and coordination issues visible on camera. These observations come from qualified professionals applying their expertise to publicly available footage. And while remote diagnosis based on video evidence carries obvious limitations, the observations themselves are not fabricated. They represent educated assessments of visible phenomena, and the administration's response has been to attack the observers rather than address the observations. The historical parallels to previous presidencies are instructive and deeply uncomfortable. When Ronald Reagan's second term progressed and observers began noting signs consistent with cognitive decline, those concerns were raised publicly and discussed openly. The mechanisms for addressing questions of presidential fitness existed and were engaged, even if imperfectly. Similar patterns have played out at various points throughout American history whenever a president's health became a subject of legitimate inquiry. But the current administration has constructed a wall of absolute denial, insisting that everything is optimal, even as the observable evidence creates room for doubt. The uncomfortable demographic reality that everyone in Washington discusses privately, but almost nobody addresses publicly, is this: Donald Trump has reached an age where health monitoring becomes not just advisable, but essential. The presidency is among the most demanding positions ever conceived by human beings. The stress is constant and crushing. The hours are brutal and unending. The cognitive load of processing intelligence briefings, diplomatic negotiations, policy decisions, and political strategy would challenge someone half the president's age. None of this means that an older president cannot serve effectively. History provides examples of leaders who performed admirably well into advanced age, but it does mean that transparency becomes more important as age increases, not less. The margin for hidden deterioration narrows. The potential consequences of concealed incapacity grow more severe. The public's need for honest assessment becomes more acute. The political dimensions of this situation are already crystallizing into campaign strategy as the midterm elections draw closer. Democratic operatives have recognized the opportunity and are moving to exploit it with professional precision. They are drawing explicit connections between the years Republicans spent questioning Biden's fitness and the current refusal to apply equivalent scrutiny to Trump. The hypocrisy argument writes itself, and it resonates with moderate voters who may not have strong partisan attachments, but who do have expectations of basic fairness and consistency. Opposition researchers are compiling comprehensive records of every public appearance where Trump appeared confused, fatigued, or off his usual form. Advertising firms are testing messaging that frames the health questions as a matter of national security rather than partisan attack. The campaign commercials that will eventually flood battleground districts are being storyboarded right now, and the administration's continued stonewalling is providing exactly the kind of negative material that makes those advertisements effective. Even Trump supporters, the voters who have remained loyal through every controversy and scandal, want to believe that their candidate is physically and mentally capable of executing the office. They are not immune to concerns about age and health. They simply process those concerns through a partisan filter that makes them reluctant to express doubt publicly. The administration's refusal to provide straightforward reassurance is a political liability that cuts across traditional demographic divisions. The institutional questions raised by this situation extend far beyond any single presidency. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution exists precisely for circumstances where presidential incapacity becomes a live concern. It establishes procedures for the transfer of authority when the president is unable to discharge the duties of the office. But those procedures depend entirely on the willingness of cabinet members and the vice president to acknowledge that a problem exists. If everyone in the chain of command is committed to maintaining the fiction that everything is fine, the constitutional safety valve never activates. This creates the possibility, which should terrify anyone who thinks seriously about governance, of a president who is not fully capable, but whose inner circle is too loyal, too compromised, or too invested in the status quo to trigger the mechanisms that exist to protect the country. The precedent being established now that presidential health information can be treated as essentially optional disclosure rather than mandatory transparency has implications that will extend far into the future. The presidency is an office defined as much much by norms and expectations as by formal rules. When a norm of transparency is shattered, it does not automatically repair itself when a new occupant takes office. Future presidents, observing how successfully the current administration has managed to withhold information, will face strong incentives to follow the same playbook. The long-term erosion of accountability is gradual until suddenly it is complete. The people who surround the president, the senior staff, the family members who serve as advisors, the loyalists who have attached their careers to his fortunes, possess information that the public does not. They see him in unguarded moments. They observe his condition at close range over extended periods. They are aware of any medical developments that may have occurred. Their decision to remain silent, to deflect questions, to attack those who raise concerns rather than addressing the concerns themselves, communicates a great deal even as their words communicate nothing. It communicates that protecting the principal is a higher priority than informing the public. It communicates that internal considerations of power and position outweigh external obligations of transparency. It communicates, perhaps most damningly, that there is something they consider worth hiding because people do not construct elaborate walls around information that would be harmless or even helpful if released. The entire situation has the unmistakable odor of a cover-up, and the tragedy may be that nothing actually requiring concealment exists. Perhaps the president's health is genuinely robust. Perhaps the episode that triggered the medical response was minor and resolved without lingering effects. Perhaps the full release of medical records would demonstrate exactly what the administration claims, that there is nothing to worry about and the president remains fully capable. But the manner in which they have chosen to handle the situation, the stonewalling, the evasion, the attacks on questioners, the refusal to engage with legitimate inquiries, is indistinguishable from the approach someone would take if they were attempting to hide something genuinely damaging. At some point, the method becomes the message, and the message being sent right now is that the truth cannot be trusted to speak for itself. The national security implications are not abstract thought experiments. They are operational realities that affect decision-making in adversarial capitals around the world. Foreign intelligence services devote enormous resources to assessing the health and stability of American leadership. When those services observe uncertainty, when they detect that the White House is concealing information about the president's condition, they adjust their calculations accordingly. They test boundaries they might otherwise respect. They pursue opportunities they might otherwise consider too risky. The perception of American weakness, whether accurate or manufactured, has real consequences in the conduct of international relations. Allies who depend on American commitments for their security begin to hedge, to explore alternative arrangements, to question whether promises made today will be honored tomorrow. The fabric of alliance systems depends fundamentally on confidence in American leadership, and that confidence is being eroded not by what is known, but by what is being hidden. The administration appears to be gambling that they can outlast the scrutiny. The strategy of riding out controversy by waiting for the next news cycle to provide distraction has worked for Trump in the past, across multiple contexts and multiple scandals. But health concerns possess characteristics that make them resistant to this approach. They do not simply disappear because attention has shifted elsewhere. They resurface, often at moments of maximum inconvenience, forced back into prominence by new episodes or new evidence. Each time they return, the questions become harder to dismiss, and the excuses become less persuasive. The cumulative effect is a gradual erosion of credibility that cannot be recovered through aggressive communication strategy. There exists also the possibility, which the administration must consider, even if they refuse to discuss it publicly, that another episode will occur. If the president experiences a further medical incident, particularly one that occurs in a public setting where concealment is impossible, the entire edifice of denial collapses instantly. The administration would lose control of the narrative completely and permanently. The questions they are currently evading would become demands backed by an overwhelming public consensus that transparency is no longer optional. Proactive honesty now, even if it requires disclosing uncomfortable information, would be strategically preferable to reactive exposure later. For ordinary citizens trying to navigate this information environment, the situation creates genuine difficulties. How does a voter evaluate a president when basic facts about his condition are being actively withheld? How does a citizen make informed decisions about electoral choices when transparency has been replaced by obfuscation? The democratic process depends fundamentally on an informed electorate. and an electorate that is being deliberately kept uninformed cannot fulfill its constitutional function. The frustration that many Americans feel, regardless of their political orientation, is rooted in this democratic injury. They are being treated as subjects to be managed rather than citizens to be informed. Congressional oversight mechanisms may eventually be brought to bear on this situation. Democratic members of relevant committees are already discussing the possibility of hearings, the issuance of subpoenas for White House medical records, the use of legislative authority to compel the disclosure that the administration is refusing to provide voluntarily. The legal questions surrounding presidential medical privacy are genuinely complex. Courts have recognized that public officials retain certain privacy rights even as they accept the diminished expectations that come with holding office. But the argument that the public interest in presidential health information overrides ordinary privacy considerations has been made successfully in other contexts, and it may be tested again. If the dispute moves into litigation, the timeline extends considerably, and the controversy continues to generate headlines throughout the process. The press corps faces its own test in this moment. The function of journalism in a democratic society includes asking questions that power prefers to leave unasked. The tradition of respecting presidential privacy has always existed in tension with the obligation to inform the public about matters of genuine consequence. Some outlets are pursuing this story aggressively, demanding answers and refusing to accept non-responsive replies. Others appear to have decided that the topic is somehow improper, that questioning a president's health represents a breach of decorum that responsible journalists should avoid. But that perspective fundamentally misunderstands the role of the press. The uncomfortable questions are precisely the ones that most need to be asked. The accountability that power resists is precisely the accountability that citizens most require. The human dimension of this story should not be lost in the political and institutional analysis. Aging is a universal experience that awaits everyone fortunate enough to live long enough. The physical and cognitive changes that accompany advancing years are not moral failings or character defects. They are biological realities that every human being must eventually confront. The question is not whether aging occurs, but how honestly we address its implications when the person aging occupies a position of extraordinary public trust. Compassion for the individual and insistence on transparency are not incompatible positions. They can and should coexist. The weeks ahead will determine whether the administration chooses a course correction toward openness or doubles down on the strategy of concealment that has characterized its response thus far. The pressure will not diminish on its own. Additional journalists will pursue the story. Additional medical professionals will offer their assessments based on publicly available information. Additional political opponents will demand disclosure. The administration will eventually reach a decision point where the costs of continued stonewalling exceed the costs of candor. What happens at that inflection point will shape not only the remainder of this presidency, but the expectations that will apply to every presidency that follows. The health of the president has become the most consequential political question in America, and nobody, not the White House communications team, not the opposition strategists, not the media establishment, appears entirely certain how to navigate it. The uncertainty itself is a form of damage, compounding daily, eroding trust incrementally, and leaving the American people in the deeply uncomfortable position of wondering whether the person they entrusted with power remains capable of wielding it. The truth will emerge eventually because truths of this magnitude always do. The only question is whether it emerges through voluntary disclosure or through the kind of crisis that makes disclosure unavoidable. The choice between those paths belongs to the administration, and their decision will reveal more about their priorities than any press release ever could.